today. Let's move on to Ukraine, which of course is another area of terrible events. And I've just picked up here with a headline by US General Mark Milley: Ukraine counteroffensive will be long and bloody. And clearly he's happy that there's going to be thousands of more Ukrainian troops sacrificed in these pointless attacks against prepared Russian positions with no air cover. I'm mentioning this several times in this report because it is so significant. No NATO country, certainly not the US or the UK, would entertain these sorts of attacks with no air cover, but we expect the Ukrainians to do it and die. And of course, where's this heading? Well, Ukraine feels it has to carry out these attacks if it's going to be fully considered to become part of NATO. This was a report from a little while ago, but what was the main statement? A strong, independent Ukraine is vital for the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. And really that quote says it all for me, because it's all about what NATO wants, and actually Ukraine is just a player, the puppet, to try and get this strong and independent NATO. Let's have a look at Zelensky when he was questioned or interviewed by CNN on how things were going on the NATO front.
Aaron asked Zelensky if he believes Ukraine will ultimately get that invitation.
We are days away from the NATO summit. Have you had any assurances, at least even from the United States, that they will directly support Ukraine's bid for membership?
Я вдячний Сполученим Штатам за ту підтримку, яка сьогодні є в нас.
I'm grateful to the U.S. for their support. President Biden and the U.S. Congress, both parties, despite their preparations for the elections, pay a great deal of attention to the war in Ukraine. They are on our side, and they support us. It's difficult for Ukraine to survive without the U.S. support, and it's a fact. I'm very direct when saying this. Without the U.S.'s help, it will become a frozen conflict. With the U.S.'s help, we will deoccupy our territory. Deoccupation of any next town is weakening Putin. We don't have to be scared of that. The U.S. decide today whether Ukraine will get invited to NATO. This is today's situation, and it's a fact. The majority of the NATO countries support inviting Ukraine to NATO. Those who have their doubts look only at President Biden, and he knows that this depends on him. It will be his decision.
So he has a decision to make coming into
this
weekend.
Yes, for today, yes. He is a decision maker for today, to be Ukrainian NATO or not to be. But we have great relations. I mean that, so he support our future in NATO. But we are speaking now about very, very important for motivation of our soldiers fact. Mm-hmm. No, invitation, just technical thing, just wording. Invitation, Ukraine to NATO.
Right. Not down the line, now.
Now. It's very important. It will push Russia. It will push our soldiers to deoccupy quicker because of the mobilization of the people. It's so important to feel that you are really be in through around allies in the future. But we know that we will never be in NATO before war finish.
So, fascinating little interview. I dislike Zelensky intensely. I don't trust him. I think he's highly manipulative man, but he's stuttering. He's got trouble there explaining the situation. And I believe that's because he doesn't understand what the situation is himself, because of course NATO is just dangling him on the end of the strings. You may possibly in the future come into NATO. And in the background, of course, things are not going well in the war, and the West media is having to start report this. So if we look at CNN here, Ukraine's counteroffensive hasn't met expectations. Here's why progress has been slow. And of course, it's not just that it's been slow, it's slow and ineffective. The territorial gains are insignificant, and they've only been achieved at very high cost in equipment and lives. But the BBC doesn't really know what to say, because they've now switched to, the problem is the lethal minefields. Ukraine war, The lethal minefields are holding up Kyiv's counteroffensive. So the BBC now no mention of the fact that the Ukrainian forces are being forced to advance with no air cover into those layered, prepared Russian defences. And if we look at some little clips here, this is nothing too much, but this is more footage of a few isolated Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles. I don't think there's any tanks in this picture, but you can see the devastation of the wooded areas. This is as a result of Russian artillery and their so-called flamethrower systems. These very small Ukrainian attacks have been wiped out with high loss of life. The Leopard tanks have not done the job. Of course, nobody expected them to, apart from the hype in Western media. And this is just one of many pictures of burnt out Leopard tanks. So nothing battle changing about the tanks, but they've certainly been changed by the battle. And the Russians have been particularly active in blowing up ammunition dumps. They've had numerous successes over recent days. Of course, the Russians are also taking casualties, but the key point is that the weight is on the Ukrainians because they are the attacking force. Meanwhile, in the background, we have many videos of very large Russian trains bringing in artillery, reinforcement, armour, and these are going on day and night, clearly demonstrating that the Russians are having no problem with actually reinforcing. We now understand that in the, we'll call it the northeastern sector of the front, Russian forces have been reinforced up to 180,000 trained troops. And at the moment, those troops are static. They're fighting off these relatively minor attacks from the Ukrainians. But in the future, we might expect them to go on the offensives themselves. The West has continually said that the Russians are going to run out of ammunition, missiles and equipment. But if we actually have a look at the Russian production facilities, this is on a scale that the US, NATO, the European Union can only dream of. And these assets are being produced increasingly quickly, and Russia has the means to get them to the front. So massive factories here producing the hardware that Russia needs. Ukraine, as we've just heard from Zelensky, can only do what it's doing with the help of the US. And meanwhile, attacks on civilians are still going on. So more raids by Ukraine into the Donetsk civilian areas. These are largely unreported in the Western media. And then we have incredible reports like this. It's from the New Voice of Ukraine, which Mike Robinson has mentioned a couple of times now. Ukraine's losses are several times less than those of the enemy. And this is Hannah Maliar, the lawyer who's the Deputy Minister of Defense in Ukraine. And if we put a bit of meat on these bones, Ukraine's combat losses are 5 times less in the south and 8 times less in the east compared to those of the Russian forces. Deputy Defense Minister Hannah Maliar told Ukraine TV broadcasters. And she also suggests that there are different methodologies, suggesting there may be more losses during an offensive than during defense, but Ukrainian losses during the offensive have not increased. And she says she's visited a hospital and they've confirmed that the situation has not worsened. Now, this is fantasy. If we go on to the Kyiv Independent here, we've got reporting Russian losses to date as 231,030 troops, and they're now talking about Russian casualties up at 770 per day for the day of July the 3rd. But of course, the reality is that the Russians are now reported as outshelling the Ukrainians by up to 10-1 in some areas of the front. So we can't possibly believe these reports that are coming out from Ukraine, that Ukraine's losses are light, and it's the Russians who are taking these massive losses. This is just not tenable, but the West simply repeats what is coming out of Ukraine. And I'll just add in here that the other thing that we need to pay attention to is that the Western media is reporting verbatim all the claims from Zelensky or his military team in their claims that the Russians are about to blow up the Zaporizhia nuclear power station. This simply doesn't make sense. They control it. It's operational. It's largely undamaged. And what would they gain by doing this to bring this sort of problem into their own territory? So a very quick summary there of what's happening in Ukraine. But the key fact is that the offensive is not going anywhere. And this is going to make Zelensky's position with NATO in that Vilnius meeting very, very difficult.